Irish question was, it was my first impression, and my first reflection was how to protect our friendship despite the result, and how to stop myself from using too dramatic narrative and comments. And the disappointment was so visible, and of course the second challenge was how to explain to our public, also to our leaders, but also to our British colleagues, what are the procedures now? Because no one, I'm talking about the British government, Brexiteers, Remainers, but also our leaders here on the continent, our institutions. In fact, no one was prepared enough, for this black scenario, for this negative result.
When that result came through, that was partly because David Cameron had called the referendum, I think you called it a stupid referendum, but he had called the referendum, and then he had tried to negotiate a new deal for Britain, particularly over immigration, and he'd been to talk to Angela Merkel and others. And I can remember when he came back to the UK thinking, this is not enough, you have not got enough to change opinion in this country. Was there a sense, looking back, perhaps the EU should have done more for David Cameron at that point?
Frankly speaking, this is the one of the most visible evidence how illusionary was the whole process of the referendum, because it was clear from the very beginning that his demands were unrealistic.
Too much.
Too much because of our treaties obligation. And it was David Cameron who set this timeline. And in this frames we had no chance to even to discuss about treaty. And frankly speaking, we gave more than we were allowed to give in our legal frameworks. But for me, it's absolutely clear that the very idea of the referendum was the biggest mistake of David Cameron. He was a Remainer, not a Brexiteer. In fact, this decision provoked the whole drama.
But all the way through that period, Mr. Tusk, there was a rising sense among a lot of British people they did not want to stay in the EU.
Yeah,
and I wonder whether there is part of you that thinks the EU has got something fairly fundamentally wrong when so many people want to leave.
No. First of all, I'm 60-year-old and well experienced. I think it's experienced enough to be also very frank with you. I remember the last 4 decades at least with this sometimes very irresponsible, sometimes even hostile narrative against the EU. The only 2 roles the EU played in British narrative was bogeyman or whipping boy. We were responsible for every failure. I think this is the main problem. And
can I put a different hypothesis to you, a different idea, which is that the problem is the EU has a single president, a single currency, a single parliament, and in many cases single parties now. But what it hasn't got is a single electorate. It hasn't got a polity, particularly for a parliamentary democracy like Britain.
This is the essence of Europe. Yeah, we are problematic.
Yeah.
We are a very complex organism. It's nothing new. Yeah, you're right. The EU is composed by more than 30 nations, 40 languages, different interests, different traditions. This is why it's for me still the EU is like a miracle, something almost impossible.
Theresa May comes in and she is determined to try to create a country in the UK which is outside the EU but is a European-style country. There's going to be a common handbook for standards and so forth. And she tries very, very hard to negotiate that. And there was a feeling, particularly around the time of the Salzburg summit, that she had been not properly treated. There was a certain amount of disrespect. She clearly thought there was disrespect for her and for Britain at that period. I wonder, is there any sense of regret for that period?
I was so direct and so frank with Theresa May because I cared. And I was, I think, very transparent with my emotions. When it comes to Theresa May, it was it's obvious trap for her. Formally, she was one of the leaders of the Remainers during the campaign. And I think surprisingly for her, she she tried at least to find the best possible solution. The problem is, and she was totally, helpless. Why? Because Brexit is about not frictionless trade, but friction more trade, if you allow me to use this neologism. Brexit is about borders. All her efforts were how to eliminate the essence of Brexit as such. Because
Brexit without Brexit.
Brexit without Brexit, we still remember this idea. In fact, the synonym of Brexit is the re-establishment of the borders. And borders means, all the grave consequences of the fact.
And so she fails in that regard, and she is replaced by Boris Johnson. You weren't surprised by the result of the referendum, you said. Were you surprised by the result of the recent general election when you heard that?
I was a little bit disappointed because of I think that you can agree with me that the statistics is quite clear. It's still 50-50 when it comes to Remainers and Brexiteers in the UK. But
a little bit more Brexiteers than Remainers.
More or less, but it's close to a draw anyway. Yes. But the Remainers, they have no clear leadership. They were not organized enough,
Let's look forward then. Do you also accept, we talked about Boris Johnson, that he is determined to wrap this up this year, that there will be no extension beyond the end of this year?
Yeah, he's quite clear in his and I think I can say even more that 1 year is enough to finalize our negotiations. What is at stake is not only economy, it's not only a trade. I think that we have to demonstrate goodwill on both sides. I mean, it's not only our responsibility, because we will finalize the trade agreement anyway. Business is business, and of course, first of all, we have to stop this narrative. The campaign is also over. Okay, Brexit. The game is over.
There's no point in a country leaving the EU in order to be exactly the same as it was before, and therefore there is going to be divergence in all sorts of areas. Is it simply the case, the more divergence, the more friction?
Yeah, it's fact, it's synonym, no doubt. But especially in trade, because we are talking about businesses, money, procedures, checks, tariffs, quotas. Here, okay, sentiments matter, but we have to be very, very realistic. And if I understand well, Boris Johnson is clearly determined not to allow that the UK will respect all the rules and procedures and standards which we have in the EU. And okay, we can accept this, but it has some grave consequences,
I suppose the issue is really going back. Do you accept fundamentally that the UK does want to leave and is going to be a different country now?
I have to respect facts first of all. And for me, what is much more important is how to protect our future against some negative emotions, against some very authentic conflicts of interest. We have also conflict of interest also among us. I mean, in the EU, it's nothing, special. And I think here, if you allow me, I have also my personal appeal to all the Remainers. I mean, in the UK and also in the EU, we can play also a very positive role after Brexit. There is life after Brexit, and it means that we can also make a positive pressure on the British government, on the European governments, European institutions, to avoid the very clear risk of some unnecessary divisions and conflicts.
You said just now that you wanted Remainers to come together and play a role going forward. What role do you think Remainers should be playing?
Not to dream about another referendum. I think it's at least this new reality will be for life. I mean, for my generation.
You won't see Britain coming back into the EU in your lifetime.
I don't think so, because it's a very massive decision, no doubt.
Do you think that Brexit could be the beginning of a problem for the EU rather than the end of a problem?
And this is even more important than our trade negotiations. That now, it was my first conversation with Donald Trump. I remember just after his election, when this was his first question. What about Brexit, Donald? And who is next in line? I was really surprised, because it was something new for me. Of course, my answer was, and this was what I believed in, that there's no queue. I mean, in fact, after Brexit, Europe was even more united. It was a paradox maybe, but it was more united than before Brexit. But now, you are right. Brexit as a political fact, the fact that such a serious country like the United Kingdom, if you can exit, it means that it's no longer an extravagance. It's not longer an
it's no longer
extremism
impossible. My part of Britain, Scotland, voted to stay inside the EU. And there are a lot of people in Scotland who hope that Scotland can become independent of the UK and then apply to rejoin the EU as a new EU country. But that would require lots of changes of rules and speeding things up. Do you think the EU would look favourably upon that?
No, I want to stop myself from saying something, too blunt, because
don't. Yeah, be as blunt as you like.
Sometimes I feel that I am Scot here. I am very Scottish now, especially after Brexit. But at the same time, I have to respect. I know how important the word sovereignty, integrity was in the internal debate in the United Kingdom. I think that it's not my role to intervene in even.
No, I understand.
Despite my sympathies and. If you ask me about legal circumstances,
yes,
what
that's
is possible, we have to be here very cautious. But we have our own treaty. If I understand well, but of course you can always interpret also treaties in very different ways. But if I understand well, the only and justified interpretation is that if something like, for example, the independence of Scotland. Happens, then we need anyway a regular new process of. There's no automaticity that,
it's a new situation.
New situation, new country. Then it means a new process of.
Because this would be a country whose people had been part of the EU for a very long time, and there'd be all sorts of questions about currency and deficits and all of those kind of things. But I think the real question is. If Edinburgh was looking for a bit of help from Brussels, would it get it?
Emotionally, I have no doubt that everyone will be enthusiastic here in Brussels and more widely, more generally also in Europe. But we have still treaties and some formalities. But if you ask me about our emotions and this, genuine feeling, of course, you will witness, I think, only empathy.
And now we have a paradox or a problem, which is you have said that we will have to stay close together and keep talking after Brexit. But at the same time, there must be an interest for the EU in Britain not doing so well after Brexit. So you can say to the other countries in the EU, look what happens when you leave. Things get worse. Yeah, and a lot of people in Britain suspect that deep down the EU wants us to fail.
No, it's not the truth. I know all these comments, but no desire to, for sort of punishment, or that we want to have this evidence that being outside the EU means some unnecessary laws. But in fact, Brexit and our negotiations after Brexit, this is a process of only damage control. The problem is that objectively, there will be some losses and damages, no doubt. But on both sides, but not as an intentional gain. It's not, for sure not.
For the very first time, the EU side is facing a British government which has a big majority and a clear, decisive leadership. Is that going to make things harder for the EU going forward?
Not at all. I think the worst situation is if we have anarchy on the other side. I mean, it's the permanent deadlock, this political impasse, this very, sometimes even, grotesque events in the House of Commons. It was something devastating, not only for your politics and democracy. It was also. Yeah, it was a clear barrier to achieve anything with it. Now, I prefer, also as a conservative, it's okay, even if we have a tougher and more difficult partner, but it's much better than anarchy or disorder.
Clarity first.
Yeah, and clarity, and you know what they want, at least, you know.
You said earlier on that you have a vivid sense of language, and you described the Brexiteers who don't have a plan as there being a special place in hell for them. Were you talking about Boris Johnson?
No, sorry. First of all, as a Pole and a Catholic, I should agree with the Polish Pope that the hell is maybe still empty.
Ah, okay.
It means that
nobody in hell.
Nobody in hell. It means also that it's a place for all of us. No, I was really angry with the people because to propose this referendum without not only preparation. We are good friends with Boris Johnson, and I still believe that when it comes to these most fundamental values, that he's still, devoted liberal conservative, and that his intention is to protect our Western civilization in the political sense of this word, and that we will find anyway a common space and also common goals, and I know that, but. So many questions was about my temperament also, and that I was maybe too vocal. But it's because of my whole life. I think that sometimes, the saying, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but we will remember the silence of our friends. And when I see that something is going wrong, I can't be silent, and I will be always, and this is why today I want to say, you will never walk alone, and you will find friends on the continent always, and I will be always at your disposal.
Donald Tusk, thanks so much indeed for talking to us. Thank you very much indeed.